Okay, so some argue that democracy is overrated and that it should be replaced with, say, an epistocracy. Why would you think
Hmm.
this is a problem? Now, I think his name is Jason Brennan,
Jason
the
Brennan, yeah, this is
contemporary
his theory.
libertarian. Yeah, that it should be
Yeah, yeah.
democracy should be replaced with an epistocracy. And for those who don't know, an epistocracy is a system of government where the intellectual elite rule, and whoever would be the intellectual elite. I'm not sure how we'd even arrive at such.
Well, I mean, you've already given essentially an important part of the answer to the
Mhm.
question, which is, Brennan lays out all these reasons why the people can't be trusted um, to, in a democracy, right? They make all these bad choices, and I really do think that classic Churchill quote about like democracy is the worst system except for all the others. It's actually very profound
Mhm.
because you think, okay, yeah, you can point to all these flaws in democracy, but in order to actually argue that we ought to replace it. You have to argue that there is another system that not just in theory, but in practice can produce better results. And when you start to think, well, how, and yeah, wouldn't it be nice if we had omniscient philosopher kings who knew all of our best interests better than we could? We didn't have to do anything because they would just rule the society perfectly and much much better than we ever could, and we could just relax. We wouldn't have to vote in elections. We just know that everything was being taken care of.
Mhm.
Yeah, that'd be great. If those people existed. In practice, those people don't exist, and that's, I mean, Brennan's a philosopher. He's not
Yeah.
a political scientist, so he's conjuring this sort of this wonderful hypothetical, and you could tell a story about these great epistocrats who rule benevolently over society. I mean,
Mhm.
I would just argue that in practice, any attempt to do what he advocates doing, that is limiting the vote, um, would be a disaster because it would result in, I mean, everyone thinks that they should be the epistocrat, right? Is there anyone who thinks that
Exactly.
they're
Yeah.
wrong about politics?
Mhm.
No, everyone thinks they're right and everyone else is wrong. So there'd just be a war to try and disenfranchise the people you think are stupid. But how do
Mhm.
you objectively decide who the epistocrats are? I mean, Brennan has his idea of who the epistocrats are, and it's people who believe in free market capitalism and libertarianism.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
but I disagree because I think that those systems are flawed. So my idea of the epistocrats is all the Bernie Sanders people. Okay, so how are we going to resolve this objectively? And the answer is we don't have an answer. And so, when you started to think about how his system would be implemented, is it like, okay, in order to vote, you have to take a test, and if you don't agree with Milton Friedman, you flunk the test and you don't get to vote.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
he
Right.
also ignores something that I think is profoundly disturbing when you work it out, which is, okay, well, in practice, the poorest people are the least well educated.
Yeah.
So aren't you going to have a system where the rich rule? If you have like an education test for voting, um, aren't you going to have a system where the poorest people, where people who have low literacy, people who are disabled, or people who just haven't had access to great schooling, they're all going to be disenfranchised, and the people who are wealthy and they went to private school and they read Plato and all that, they all pass their voting test and they all get to vote.
Mhm.
And I think that profoundly conflicts with some of our basic moral intuitions about voting as a universal human right. That
Yeah.
is, you have a right to participate in the decision over what the government should be. The
Mhm.
the other point that I make about this is that it's deeply authoritarian because there's a
Certainly.
lot of people who advocate like voting tests and that sort of thing. And you think, well, okay, but what you're saying when you believe in a voting test is the government, let's just go back to the government,
Yeah.
but this is a case in which the government gets to decide who gets to decide what the government should be. That is
Mhm.
to say, instead of what is called the consent of the governed, that is, it is the shape of the government and the people who are in it. That's decided by the people who are ruled over by it.
Mhm.
Instead, the people who rule over, they decide whether the populace and gets to participate and to what degree. And so it's a reversal of the relationship of the governed to the government, where a Democrat believes that the governed have the right to throw out their government, whereas
Mhm.
the epistocrat believes that the government has a right to tell the populace, no, we're going to tell you what to do, and you don't get to say, because we've decided that you're not among those who are worthy enough to participate in decision making. You've been excluded.
Yeah, that strikes me as very authoritarian, like you said.
Yeah.
Totally antithetical to.
Not libertarian. It's
Yeah, yeah.
especially just libertarian, which is the
Right,
crazy
right.
thing.
And you know, Nathan, you mentioned the CIA earlier. Think about the CIA for a moment as an agency that doesn't have that democratic accountability at all. You know, look
Yeah.
at their overthrowing of, foreign democracies, or the subversion of democracies, or even I think I was reading an article by you or Noam Chomsky, and you were talking about how just the CIA torturing certain persons. I believe it was you who said that. I don't remember though. But
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
anyway,
they've got a really heinous record.
right.
A lot of which hasn't even come to light because they're so unaccountable that they can,
That's what I mean.
can
Yeah,
conceal their own records and classify them, and we don't know till decades later what they've actually done. I mean, there are plenty of cases where we still don't know the extent of their involvement in things that we kind of
exactly.
suspect they were involved in.
Yeah. So if we had a government functioning under an epistocracy, I could see very similar things happening.
It'd be
No
even
kinds of,
worse.
yeah, democratic accountability at all.
They'd tell you nothing. You would
Right.
you would have
Hmm.
no idea what your government was doing
Hmm.
because they don't feel any need to tell you about it.
Yeah,
You would have no way of throwing them out. If they, what happens if the epistocrats get corrupt? You
hmm,
think that's never going to happen?
hmm.
What do you do to get rid of them? Do you just have to stage a revolution, right? Because you can't vote them out because they prohibited you from voting because they said you weren't smart enough.
It's a great point.
Um,
Hmm.
and Brennan's book doesn't answer these questions at all. I mean, I read it, and it's just deeply unsatisfying in these respects.